Hey everyone, this is Ensign Flood. Today let's talk about valvular disease since this is a really high yield topic for both step 1 and step 2. So let's just dive right in. So the first thing I like to think about is simply where the valves are going to be creating the murmur that we can auscultate. So you might remember the mnemonic apartment M. I find this really helpful. So basically what this refers to is that if we were to take the A, it would be at the right side of our sternum, the second intercostal space. The pulmonic murmurs would be on that left side, still the second intercostal space. Tricuspid would be a little bit lower on the left side, so this would be the fourth intercostal space by the sternum. And then the mitral valve would be heard at the apex. So just kind of visualizing this a little bit better. So here we have the heart, so you can see basically the aortic valve murmurs are going to reverberate up to the second intercostal on the right, and then the pulmonic murmurs will basically have reverberation up to the left second intercostal. And then again, the tricuspid valve is going to be down on the fourth intercostal left side, and the mitral valve is going to have reverberations over at the apex. So just thinking about a couple of different ways that the valve can cause these murmurs is stenosis and regurgitation. So basically I've drawn this nice normal looking valve in the center panel. So basically what's going to happen is the valves are going to open and close synchronously depending on whether we're in diastole or systole, and blood should basically flow through in a forward type of pattern. In stenosis, what happens is that these valves become so thickened and sclerotic that basically it's going to impede that flow, so we need much higher pressure to essentially get any blood through, otherwise it's essentially kind of dripping. And in regurgitation, we have the opposite effect, which is basically you get these really floppy and weak valves. So the way that I like to imagine this is that basically a pressure is going to essentially slam them against the wall of either the ventricle or the vessel. So what's going to happen is you're essentially going to get this effective hole in the heart is how I describe it, and you'll see why in a little bit. And basically what that means is that blood flow is going to go through, but then you're going to lose that pressure gradient, so you'll have a lot of regurgitation. So the other thing that's really important is thinking about whether you hear the murmur in systole or diastole, because this helps us kind of understand a little bit more about the type of process that's going on. So just to recap, systole is basically when the heart chamber is full of blood at the very beginning, and then it generates this pressure, and that pressure overcomes the opening pressure of the valve that's basically above it, quote unquote, and then essentially squeezes all of the blood out into that vessel or ventricle that's ahead of it. So this basically happens at the S1 sound is how I think about it. So that's when either the mitral or the tricuspid valves, which lie above the ventricle, are closing. So that's, again, S1. And then by the time that all of the blood is squeezed out, so let's say from the right ventricle into the pulmonary circuit, the aortic and the pulmonic valves will close, and that generates the S2 sound. So then basically at the S2 sound, you get the beginning of diastole, right? Because now the heart is going to start relaxing, opening, and I sort of think of that as like a vacuum because the heart's a pump, so it pulls blood into it. And again, we start the cycle all over again once the heart's full and the mitral and the tricuspid valves close with S1. Okay, so this is really important because systolic murmurs are not always pathological. They certainly can be, but diastolic murmurs always are. And so somebody really clever once told me a nice kind of way to organize this is through the mnemonic MAM, SIR, SIR. So what do I mean by that? I mean MAM on the left and SIR, SIR on the right. So let's go through how I organize this. So MS is mitral stenosis. So basically what you get here is this diastolic opening snap because enough pressure has basically built above the mitral valve to force it open. So you hear a snap and then this rumble as the blood comes rushing through. So basically all the blood is going from the left atrium to the left ventricle, and then it essentially goes and fills up the ventricle, so it diminishes in intensity. Then you have AR. So this is aortic regurgitation. This is another diastolic murmur. So basically what happens here is that the weak, floppy aorta slams against, I like to think of the ventricle that's been pulling in blood. So it's basically pulling the blood that's sitting on top of the aortic valve back into the heart. And so what does that do? Well, it's an aortic regurgitation. So all that blood is basically sliding back in. And so you can see that it's most pronounced early diastole and then decreasing intensity. Now, AS is aortic stenosis. So again, another kind of crusty valve. So what happens here is called a diamond or mid-systolic crescendo, decrescendo murmur. So you can see now it's gone from the diastolic to the systolic side. So basically what happens here is the heart is squeezing blood, right? And the pressure is going up and up and up and up and up. And it's eventually enough to start opening up that valve. You can kind of think of it like a whistle. So basically it starts squeezing blood through the valve. The valve suddenly becomes fully open. And now there's less volume left in the ventricle to push through that valve. So crescendo, decrescendo. And here you have what's called a radiation. So it's basically this quality that it's a really noisy murmur that carries sounds or radiates all the way to the carotid. So radiation carotids is an aortic stenosis. Okay, last one. This is the mitral regurgitation. And actually, like, a lot of things fall under this umbrella, so let's go through this. So mitral regurgitation. I mentioned that I like to think about regurgitation kind of creating this hole in the heart because basically the valves kind of slap open to the sides of the ventricle or the vessel, right? And so hole for hollow systolic, or sometimes people refer to this as pansystolic. So basically you hear these murmurs being mitral or tricuspid regurgitation. And also some really kind of unusual ones like a ventral septal defect. So basically, because it's essentially a hole in the heart, right? That's how I kind of cluster these together. It's going to be a hollow systolic. Also, in the case of post-MI complications, if you hear a new harsh hollow systolic murmur, it's going to be indicative of an intraseptal rupture. And so that's going to be really harsh and come with shock. But if it's more of a mild type of non-harsh murmur, it could be a papillary muscle rupture. So basically that's talking a little bit about the pitch and quality, right? If you have a really high pressure murmur, it's going to be really high pitched. If you have a really low pressure murmur, it's going to be really low pitched. And the harshness kind of comes from that. Now, I mentioned that there was radiation to the carotids in aortic stenosis. Here, there's radiation to the left XLO, so something to remember. All right, so just to kind of put all of this together for you, MAM, SIR, right? So again, mitral stenosis is going to be that opening snap, and then the rumble, and then the aortic regurgitation is going to be that decrescendo. Aortic stenosis is going to be the crescendo, decrescendo. Your mitral regurgitation and basically those quote-unquote holes in the heart, right, are going to be holosystolic. And again, systolic murmurs are going to have the radiation. Diastolic are always going to be pathological. Now really quickly, let's go into some of the grading systems. So the major thing to know right here is that depending on how well you can hear the murmur, is going to be the intensity of the murmur. A big takeaway point for me is that once you get to grade 3, which is like medical student level of easily audible, you want to work it up and do an echo. So you notice that this is systolic murmurs for these 6 grades. Diastolic is typically less tested. That's 4 different grades, but you always want to work up a diastolic murmur anyway. And with both, you want to do echo. So basically, in summary, Location, don't forget apartment M. Timing, diastolic and systolic. Shape, am, sir. The pitch, we talked about high pressure is high pitch and vice versa. The radiations that occur in the systolic murmurs, and the intensity you want to work up either greater than 3 or a diastolic murmur with echo. All right, great job. Study hard, guys.